Hi guys, it's Alexandra here. Welcome back to my channel. I know it has been over a month at this point since I've made a video, and I really do want to say thank you to all of you who've been patient with me as I have had to take a little bit of time off of YouTube because it has been a lot of work getting ready to start a new school year and starting a new school year. It's actually Friday, August 21st, and I just finished my first week of my third year of teaching. It's been a lot of hard work getting ready to go back because my school is doing a hybrid model. So we are in class in person with students 4 days a week, with students being there on alternating days. And then on Friday, all of the teachers are in the building doing professional development and working on other things because the students are doing e-learning from home. And that for us does include being on there for office hours. So it's been a lot. It's been good, I would say. Overall there's some big positives to the whole hybrid learning thing, especially for me, smaller class sizes. But I wanted to just stop in here today and kind of talk to you about some of the books that I've read over the last couple of months, because as I looked back in my channel, I didn't see a place where I had really gotten to sort of wrap up and just briefly talk to you about how I've been feeling about the books that I've been reading. And even though the month of August is not over, I wanted to share with you the books that I finished so far, as well as tell you the books that I am currently reading. So let's go ahead and get into this. Alright, so I went ahead and just went back towards the end of June because I did not do a whole ton of reading in the month of June, but I did finish Keeper of the Lost City's Nightfall, which this is book 6 in this series by Shannon Messenger. I really love this series. I look forward to reading the next one when it strikes my fancy, hopefully in the next couple of months before the end of 2020. I would really like to be caught up with the entire series, but essentially this is a middle grade fantasy novel that follows our main character, Sophie, who figures out or finds out that she is an elf in the first book and is taken off and kind of thrown into this new life. And she is really struggling not only with the challenges of being a young adult, but also adjusting to a new culture and a new way of life and just figuring out how to be authentically herself. I really love this series. I talk about it all the time, but this has been a top-notch book. I think I gave this a 5 out of 5 stars, which I have my little calendar I keep my book thoughts in down here. So 5 out of 5 for Keeper of the Lost City's Nightfall. Okay, so the next book I read was in July, and it was Nightmare on Elstree by Levine. This is a short story. It's basically a mini cozy mystery. I really liked it. It was quite funny. In this story, our main character is trying to get into the writing business, but in the meantime, she is asked to take a job as an elf. So, when you go take your kiddos to see Santa, she is working as one of the people who is helping get them to and from Santa. And she does not want to do it. It's super degrading. She's got the ugliest costume in the world. And not to mention the fact that one of the people that she works with is absolutely horrendous. And she's just absolutely despising her job, and it only gets worse when one of the people she works with ends up dead, and she is one of the suspects, and she's kind of got to quickly clear her name because she not only didn't do it, but she knows that having this pointed at her could possibly ruin her future career. So I really did like this. I've read The 12 Desserts of Christmas by Joanne Fluke. I enjoyed that because I generally enjoy her writing, but I actually think I enjoyed Nightmare on Elstree a little bit more. And as I looked back on Goodreads, I gave this a 4 out of 5 stars. There's one more book in here called The Christmas Thief, and it's by Leslie Meyer, and I'm hoping to finish this bind up before the end of the year. I'll probably wait to read that third story a little closer to Christmas time because they are all obviously Christmas themed stories. Alright, so the next book that I read, I actually listened to it through audiobook on Libby, and that was Inferno by Dan Brown. It is in his Robert Langdon series, and I really enjoy this one. I had read it one other time prior to this most recent reread, and it is just such a fantastic book. I really enjoy the whole series, and I don't think you can go wrong. All of them are just all of them are just fascinating reads, and they keep you intrigued and on your toes throughout the whole story. I like that he really toes that line between real factual things that are happening in the world or have happened in history, and blends that so nicely with the more fictionalized side of the story that helps the whole reading experience just feel quite seamless. Next in July, I did finish up The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes by Suzanne Collins. I did a whole book review on this on my channel. I originally gave this a 3 out of 5 stars. I would really like to reread it now that I've kind of sat on the story itself for a little while and see if my reading would change having read it a second time, because as I think back on it a little bit more, I really did enjoy the overall reading process. I think I got caught up in some of the aspects of the story and the construction of the story that I didn't care for so much. But I'm wondering if, now that I know that's kind of how it is, if I wouldn't enjoy the story overall a bit more when I reread it in the future. But I did like this book. If you liked the original Hunger Games series, I highly suggest that you try reading this book. It is a prequel that follows the main character, Coriolanus Snow, who becomes President Snow in the original books. It's kind of like his backstory / origin story. It is interesting. I don't think it's a perfect book, but I do think it's a pretty darn decent and interesting read. Next, in the month of July, I finished up Origin by Dan Brown. This is the latest installment in his series, in this particular series, and I really liked this book, you guys. I ended up giving it a 4 out of 5 stars. I actually think that it may get a higher rating if I reread it again. This was just so entertaining. It essentially follows our main character, Robert. He is invited to this big event where one of his former students and his friends is going to unveil this new scientific discovery that is going to turn world religion on its heels. And there's millions of people watching, and then there's just a tragic event that happens at this unveiling, and Robert is thrust into the middle of trying to figure out what's happening, because it is entirely likely that there are main players in the major government of Spain, where this book takes place, involved in the crime that took place. And Robert also is trying to make sure that his friend's scientific discovery still gets to see the light of day. I really liked this book a lot. I really liked the audiobook. I kind of flipped back and forth between the audiobook, the actual print book, and then also following along in the book while the audiobook was playing. But again, I love this series. I highly recommend. The next book I finished up in the month of July was The Devil in the White City by Erik Larson. I, on Goodreads, originally gave this a 3 out of 5 stars, and I've been sitting with this book for quite a while now, and when I first finished it, I wasn't sure it was my favorite. I really liked certain portions of this book. This book follows Chicago during the time of the World's Fair. Half of the book is centered on the architects who were crafting the World's Fair and all of the different people involved in that process. And then the other half of the story follows the murderer H.H. Holmes as he is on his crime spree during the same time frame of the World's Fair. I started reading this book because I was really intrigued by the H.H. Holmes story and wanted to know more. I had watched a lot of documentaries on YouTube about his story, and I wanted to see kind of how it intertwined with the events that were going on in Chicago at that time. But I did not find the architecture chapters as interesting, just because I'm not super into architecture. However, I got done with this book, and it kept coming up in conversation, about what I was reading, and I found myself just spewing off all this really cool information about the architecture side of the World's Fair from this book. And I started to realize that I actually did enjoy that material more than I thought I would. I guess I just wish there had been maybe a little bit more of the H.H. Holmes side. Okay, moving on to the books that I have read so far in August. The first one that I read was The Promise of the Grand Canyon by John F. Ross. I actually listened to this as an audiobook from Libby, and it is essentially a story about John Wesley Powell's journey through the Grand Canyon. He led an expedition through much of the length of the Grand Canyon on the Colorado River, and it was pretty darn good. I wouldn't say it was my favorite nonfiction book I've read this year. I think the plot meandered a little bit. I really wish the story would have just been focused on that particular expedition and maybe some of the backstory from him. But we got a lot of stuff that happened after, and it really felt like it was more like a biography of John Wesley Powell instead of the story of that particular expedition. And I mean, it wasn't like there were a lot of other people that the author focused on, but I wish that it had just been focused on that particular journey, because that's why I was interested in the book, and I was kind of disappointed when we got past that part of the book. I was like, oh, well, it's not that I don't care, I'm just not as interested about how things went after, even though his story was actually very interesting and he did leave quite the impact when it comes to environmental care and thought when it comes to building cities in the West. It wasn't my favorite nonfiction book that I've read so far this year, so I ended up giving it a 3 out of 5 stars. The next book I read was an ebook that I borrowed from Libby, and it was Wild by Cheryl Strayed. This is a memoir, and essentially it is Cheryl talking to us about her time on the Pacific Crest Trail. So she hiked the Pacific Crest Trail in the early 90s, not too long after it became an official scenic trail. And for those of you who don't know, the Pacific Crest Trail starts at the border of California and Mexico and goes all the way up to the border of Washington State and Canada. Essentially, you start at Mexico and you end in Canada. And it is quite the journey. I have been really into recently watching a lot of hiking videos like Homemade Wanderlust. She has an absolutely wonderful channel that I have enjoyed watching. She has hiked she's hiked all 3 of the Triple Crown Trails, so Appalachian Trail, Pacific Crest Trail, and Continental Divide Trail. And her channel is just really interesting, and it's gotten me back into hiking, which I already enjoyed, but I really wanted to read the book Wild after I got back into watching those hiking videos. And I really did like this book. Cheryl's story is very interesting. This book definitely doesn't hold back. She freely talks about some major pitfalls in her life, and some flaws in her character are talked about very freely, which I think is important, because that's what this book is supposed to be, is a real life account of who she was as a person before she went on trail, and her adventures on trail, and how they began to help shape her into the woman that she is today. And I think if you enjoy hiking, I think if you need a story about redemption and figuring out who you are as a person, I think if you want a book where people are reconnecting with nature and just really figuring out what's important in life, if you are looking for a good story just to kind of remind you of the importance of looking at every moment as an opportunity, I think this could be a great book for you to read. Overall, hearing her story, it just felt like I was kind of there on the trail with her, and I think I learned a lot from her story that I can apply to my own life and just really help me focus on taking each day as a blessing and really loving the people around me, because we don't ever know how much time we have with them. The last book that I have read so far in August is Bringing Down the Duke by Evie Dunmore. This is a historical romance that follows our main character, Annabelle. She is a new female student attending Oxford University, and she is there on scholarship, and essentially as part of her scholarship, she must try to get the wealthy and influential men of society on the side of the suffragettes in hopes of changing some of the laws in England at the time that were keeping women from having their deserved autonomy and strength within marriages, especially when it came to owning their own property even after they were married. I enjoyed this book. I don't think I loved it as much as other people did. There was this kind of huge hype around this book, so I thought I was going to go into it and it would be a 5-star read. I still did really enjoy it. I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. Generally, my biggest qualm with this book was that it was very insta-lovey, even though they tried to make it seem like it wasn't. So Annabelle and the main male character, they meet very, like, suddenly, and it just seems like from that moment it's like, oh my gosh, she was the most beautiful person I've ever seen. And he, you know, takes a little warming up, but not much, and it just happens really quick. And I don't normally mind that too much, but for some reason in this book it felt a little like pushed or contrived, and maybe that's just because I didn't necessarily care for how it was set up, I guess. But overall, I did enjoy the story. I will read the next one in this series when it comes out, because this is going to be part of a larger overall series. I think it will follow different characters, but I liked it. It was fun. I think if you're just looking for kind of a fun, fluffy read, you are expecting maybe some insta-love type stuff, this could be a good book for you to read. And yeah, I guess I would recommend it. Just know that it definitely does have kind of that more instant love, like, oh man, I like them because they're beautiful type of relationship. Not necessarily, I like you because you're kind, you're wise, you're intelligent, that kind of stuff. It's definitely more of like a insta-lust type of situation, in my opinion. Alrighty, so obviously the month is not done. I do have 3 books that I am currently reading. Yes, 3. I am struggling a little bit with what I feel like reading day to day. It is changing greatly, so that's why I've ended up with 3 books that I'm currently reading, and I'm hoping that maybe by the end of the month I can have 1 or 2 of these finished, and I don't think I'll finish all 3, but who knows? You never know. The first one that I'm reading is Isaac's Storm by Erik Larson. This is following the story of Isaac Klein, who was a meteorologist in Galveston, Texas, during the time of the 1900 hurricane that basically wiped Galveston off of the map. I am not very far into this book, however, it is very short. I think this is going to be really interesting once we get going, because essentially it is just going to follow the timeline of how things unfolded. This was a massive natural disaster tragedy, and it's just, I don't know, the town of Galveston is so fascinating to me because of instances like this, and then how this pattern has just kind of occurred with it being run down by storms, but the people always seem to continue to return and rebuild their lives there, which is just a fascinating thing to me. So I'm interested in learning about this particular storm, and also interested in learning about Isaac Klein and kind of how his life was affected by being there during this time, and in particular, how did his role as a meteorologist play out in this unforeseen circumstance when basically we still didn't know anything about hurricanes. What was it like for him? The next book I picked up was Still Knife Painting by Cheryl Holland. I did get to the point where I'd read 5 books off of my shelf, so I went ahead and got this one. It is the first book in her A Paint and Shine mystery series. It follows our main character, Miranda, who is running a business where essentially you hike up to a beautiful spot in the wilderness, and then she takes you through a painting, and then you hike back down and you get cooked this southern home style meal, and then at the end you taste test different types of moonshine, and obviously somebody ends up dead, and then she is thrown into the mix of trying to figure out who the murderer really is. So I'm liking it so far. I am not very far into this one either, about 34 pages to be exact, but it is fun. I like the fact that it's set in nature. I like the fact that it's set in Kentucky, so it just feels like someplace I'd like to go someday. And honestly, the idea of having a painting class in the middle of the woods, I think would be pretty awesome. So this is good. And last but not least, I am currently reading Midnight Sun by Stephanie Meyer. I am 178 pages into this book, and I am really enjoying it so far, you guys. This was a book that I had planned on buying long before I went on my low buy, so I still went ahead and purchased this. I am tabbing it out in the hopes of doing a spoiler-filled book talk when I'm all done, but I love it. I miss the world of Twilight. It is fascinating to me to be back in this story, but in a completely different perspective, because this is the story of Twilight, the first book told through the perspective of Edward. So it's just way different because so far all we've really been focused on is his family and Bella. And in the first book, you know, there's so many characters that Bella is meeting, and in particular I think of people like Billy and Jacob, and we have heard nothing about them so far in this book. I'm sure that we will at some point, because they do kind of start to come into play with the whole secret of their tribe. But it is just cool to be back in Forks and to have this look and this take on the things that were happening. But funny story, I bought this book on Thursday, August 13th, and I got home and I was reading it. I started reading it on Friday, and then on Saturday morning I woke up and was reading some more, and all of a sudden I realized that there was a whole chunk of my book that was missing. So it was missing like 79 pages, and then later in the book it repeated another like 80 to 100 pages over again. So basically it was a misprint. I had to traipse back out to Barnes & Noble and be like, hey guys, look at this. It's missing a whole bunch of pages, and it has a reprint of the same chunk of pages over again. And they were like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, we'll replace that. And the guy who I was talking to went over to the table where they had all of their copies of Midnight Sun, and they only had signed copies left. And he's like, well, we only have signed copies. I was like, well, I guess I'll pay extra for a signed copy because I'm already over 100 pages into this book. I just want to be able to read it. So I was able to get myself a signed copy of Midnight Sun, and it actually was the same price as the book that I had purchased. They just didn't have the signed copies the day that I went in. They must have been out and had gotten more. But that is what I'm reading right now. I think my first focus is going to be getting a bit farther in Midnight Sun, because that's just kind of where my heart is, and then going on from there, probably still knife painting. But that is it. Those are the books I've read over the last couple of months and what I'm currently reading. Thank you guys so much for watching. Tell me in the comments below what you have been reading over these last few months, but mainly and most importantly, stay safe, stay happy, stay healthy, and I will talk to you next time. Bye.